Well, hey everybody, welcome to this special interview with my good friend, Mr. Travis Lacy. Travis, how you doing, brother?
Doing good. Thanks for having me, Keith. How are you?
Awesome. I'm doing great. Friends, welcome to a great episode here on my YouTube channel. We'll start doing more of these interviews, and I'm very excited to welcome Travis here tonight, and I want to thank you for taking time to be here. Let's talk about who you are a little bit, and then we're going to get into your story about your amazing Catholic conversion in your life since then. So Travis Lacy, Dr. Travis Lacy.
That's right.
I don't think you've ever told me I need to call you that. But,
No, please don't.
Okay, well.
You're a peer. My students have to call me doctor or professor.
Professor.
Yeah.
I've always wanted to be called like something cool like that, like special agent or Mr. President or professor, but.
Yeah, it's basically the same thing, yeah.
So you have a bachelor's in English from Hillsdale College, and then you have a master's in theology from Duke University, and then a PhD in theology from Notre Dame. How old are you, for crying out loud? And why aren't you wearing tweed?
Yeah, I don't dress very professorially. I have certain friends who are the spitting images of professors in tweed and elbow patches, and I guess I just don't fit the bill. But I'm 33.
Okay, 33.
The year Jesus died, so
This
what
is a
have
big
I
year.
done in my time?
It's a big year for you.
Yeah.
Well, you've been doing this for 3 years now. You've
That's
been a
right.
theology professor for 3 years.
That's right.
But you've been married 11 years to your wife, Shannon. You have 5 kids. Mm-hmm. We just had an awesome time hanging out tonight with those great kids. And you've spent the last few years at Mount Mercy, but now you're moving out to Providence.
That's right. Yeah, so after I finished my PhD at Notre Dame, I was hired at Mount Mercy, so this is my first big boy job. I say, when I graduated college, I just decided to stay in school for more years, so I didn't have a job like a real adult for a long time. But after I finally finished at Notre Dame, Mount Mercy was my first job as a professor. And then, now we're moving on to Providence this fall.
Wow. So you're a theology professor, and you used to be an evangelical.
That's right.
But now you're Catholic. And I want to get into that here because a lot of people watch this channel because they're interested in the Catholic faith, their conversion to the Catholic faith. And I remember hearing a little bit of your story a couple of years ago, and I thought, man, it's always amazing to me how people wind up where they are when it comes to their faith, especially converts. So yeah. I would love to get into some of that. But let's talk about your childhood, where you were born, and what was that like for you growing up?
Yeah, so my childhood is really foundational to the story of how I became Catholic. So I was born in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, to 2 very devout, wonderful evangelical parents. So my parents raised me in a non-denominational Bible church. Now, I don't know if your listeners maybe know what that is or not, but a non-denominational church is essentially Baptist theologically. They believe generally the same things that Baptists do, but they don't belong to the denomination. They take very seriously this idea that you shouldn't have any merely human authority other than the Word of God. And a denomination would be a kind of human authority. Mm-hmm. And so a Bible church is a church that sees the Bible alone as its authority. Which is even a bit more radical than even certain other Protestant denominations, right, that have denominational oversight and things like that. So I was raised in a non-denominational Bible church, and my parents really, and that church that they raised me in, really laid the foundation for the Christian faith. I was immersed in Christianity from a very young age. We went to church not just on Sundays, but also on Wednesdays, and basically any other day of the week that it happened to be open. My parents also sent me to a private Christian school where I had Bible classes.
Now, what part of the country is this?
Yeah, so Oklahoma is a part of the country.
Oh, you were down there.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
right. Yeah.
That's a whole nother level of not being Catholic.
That's right. Catholics are, I don't want to say virtually non-existent, but there's not very many Catholics. I didn't know a single Catholic until I got to college. And that would obviously become important. We can get to that in a second.
Yeah.
But I didn't know a single Catholic. I had heard of Catholics. I had one friend at my church whose dad was Catholic. His mom was not, and his mom, got to make the decision about which church the kid went to. But I didn't actually know a single Catholic. So Oklahoma is it's a part of the country that's often referred to as the Bible Belt. It's where evangelical Protestantism is really the religious lifeblood of the culture and the society. And even today, I think that's still true. So I was raised around mostly other evangelicals, both obviously at my church, but even at my school. There were very few kids at my school who belonged to some kind of denomination. Like I think I knew one Presbyterian. I didn't even know a single Lutheran, a single Anglican. They were basically all kind of Baptists or non-denom evangelicals.
So you're growing up in this evangelical household. Like, how important was your faith to your life, though? Were you someone who had your own personal experience of Christ, or was it just sort of built into the fabric of your family upbringing?
Yeah, I would say it was both. Christianity in one sense is all I've ever known. And as I've gotten older, I've grown to really embrace that and cherish it and be thankful for it. There was a time when I was in junior high and high school where I sort of resented the fact that I didn't have this really cool conversion story, because especially in evangelical circles, sometimes people can get a lot of cred, by telling some conversion story where they were, on drugs, passed out under a bridge, having just visited a prostitute, and then Jesus, like a lightning bolt from the sky, swoops in and saves them. And it's this really cool story, about how I was down at the bottom of human, I was in the bottom depths of human despair, and then Jesus swooped in and saved me. And those stories are beautiful. And I remember, especially in junior high and early high school, I was sort of jealous that I didn't have a story like that. And all I could say when we would share our testimonies with other people was that, well, faith in Jesus is all I've ever known. I never remembered the moments. That's a big thing for evangelicals. For some, not all, but for some evangelicals, it's really important to know your spiritual birthday, right? The moment where you accept Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior. And gosh, I started accepting Jesus as my personal Lord and Savior when I was probably 5, right? And then never stopped, because you're not sure if it works the first time, right? And so you do it again, every now and then.
Recommitment.
That's exactly right.
We're going to do a rededication of your dedication.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So it was the air I breathed, but it was part of my experience as well, where I really did aspire to, because it was what my church and my parents encouraged me to do, was to have a real relationship with Jesus.
So in all of that, did you have any experience with Catholics or Catholicism at all? Where did that fit into your worldview?
It didn't fit at all. They might as well have been aliens. In fact, one example that I can think of how foreign Catholicism was to me, I mentioned that I went to a private Christian school, and my junior year of high school, I had this Bible teacher. So we had Bible classes. That was one of the subjects we took. I took, math, history, English, and Bible. And junior year of high school, I had a Bible teacher who I respected very much. And to this day, I'm still very grateful for him. And I owe him a lot, actually. He taught me a lot. But in junior Bible, we covered world religions. So in addition to Bible, right, you have a segment where you cover other religions. And one of the things we covered was Catholicism. And I'll never forget that one of the things that this Bible teacher, again, who I respected a lot, one of the things he told us that Catholics believed was that they believe that the Pope is infallible, but only when he's sitting in his special chair.
Yes.
And I remember just hearing that at the time, and I respected this teacher and thought, oh, wow, that's sort of crazy. And then after I became Catholic, for some reason, I remembered this. And it occurred to me then that the way he must have put this together is that he must have seen the phrase ex cathedra, which means from the
chair.
Exactly. So he must have seen this Latin phrase, ex cathedra, that means from the chair, which, in Catholic theology means speaking from the office of St. Peter, right? From the office of the Bishop of Rome, in that capacity. And he just took it literally and said, oh, there's a special chair, and when you speak from the chair, then you're infallible. This is my Bible teacher. He was an authority figure. And again, I share that not to say, oh, my Bible teacher was so stupid. Not at all. He wasn't. That's just how foreign Catholicism was. Like, we had no one to correct those misconceptions. That's how wild the kind of misconceptions were. So it didn't figure into my faith at all as a kid.
So when was your first experience with Catholics that made even just you have a different view at all?
Yeah, so that happened when I got to college. Now, I want to back up a little bit here, because when I got to college, I actually wanted to be a Protestant pastor.
Okay.
This is something that I had decided that I thought that I had discerned, and I actually did discern. I'll come back to that point in a second, but from the time that I was 14, I thought that I wanted to be a Protestant pastor. And this really started with my freshman Bible teacher. So, in another one of these Bible classes, as a freshman in high school, I was just sort of enraptured by my Bible classes. And my Bible teacher seemed to know where everything was in the Bible. She knew seemingly every verse. And it's had this absolute command of the Bible. Shout out to Mrs. Mosley. Mrs. Mosley, my freshman Bible teacher.
Mrs. Mosley, you rock.
That's right. Yeah, I'm very grateful for Mrs. Mosley. I remember I would stay around after class and talked to her about the Bible, and she really encouraged me to read it more deeply. And I even was so inspired to try to read the Bible more deeply that I wanted to be able to read it in the original languages. So I couldn't teach myself Greek, but I asked my pastor, like, what do I do if I want to know the Greek word for something, but I don't know Greek? And so he hooked me up with this book. I still remember what it's called. It's by a guy named Spyros Zodhiates, great Greek name. And Zodhiates had this Greek word study New Testament where it'd have the English and it'd have the Greek with like a number system. And you could look up the number for the Greek word and it'd tell you where this Greek word was used in every verse in the New Testament. And that allowed you to kind of piece together. And you could say, oh, this Greek word is actually the same word used in this other verse. And here it has that kind of connotation. And so that's what I was doing when I was 14 in high school. And I say that not to give myself any credit, but to say that I was immersed in this environment where knowing the Bible deeply and thoroughly was really encouraged. And I took this to heart, and I discovered that I loved learning about the Bible so much and talking about it to others that I thought, well, maybe God wants me to be a pastor. This is what I enjoy doing. I seem to have a passion for it, and so maybe it's what God wants for me. And so I wanted to be a Protestant pastor. And even at that Christian school, one of the offices they had, so in high schools you have student offices, like you have a class treasurer, class president, class secretary. We had class chaplains. And one of the roles of the chaplain was to help prepare weekly chapels, which were sort of weekly little 45-minute worship and kind of message gatherings that we would have on Wednesdays. And as chaplain, it was my job to speak at chapel sometimes. And so I would give these little 8 to 10 minute devotionals, which is kind of funny to think about because in Catholicism, 8 to 10 minutes is a homily.
That's
right?
like a long sermon.
It's a homily, exactly. But in the evangelical world, that's like the kids stuff. That's the devotional, And I enjoyed doing this. I enjoyed talking about the Bible and what I was learning in the Bible to others. So I thought that I was supposed to become a pastor. I love doing this kind of thing, and kept reading the Bible very, very seriously. I tried to commit a lot of it to memory. And so when I got to college, I arrived with a pretty good sense of what was in them. I knew the Bible pretty well, even for your average 18-year-old evangelical. And again, I say that not to credit myself, but just to say that I thought that this was part of my vocation, that I needed to know it, front to back. And so when I went to Hillsdale College as a freshman, and I met a Catholic for the first time, a guy who would end up becoming my best friend there and my roommate, a guy named Eric. I remember thinking that this biblically ignorant, Mary worshiping papist, he doesn't stand a chance against the likes of me.
You're going to convert him.
Oh yeah, exactly, because I knew that I knew the Bible so much better than he did. And the funny thing is I was right. I did know the Bible better than he did, but that wasn't enough, right? My sort of quick knowledge in and around the various chapters and verses wasn't enough to kind of settle the arguments you would have. But it was really going to college and meeting Eric, and along with Eric, the other Catholics at Hillsdale, that were really Catholicism became a live presence for the first time in my life.
What was it about them that made you at least take the faith a little bit seriously, or take them a little bit seriously?
Yeah, it was absolutely the sanctity and the holiness of their lives. And that might sound odd because I knew sanctified, I knew holy Protestants. So it's not like being in the presence of personal sanctity was new for me. But for a Protestant, at least for a Protestant who takes their tradition seriously, Catholic sanctity is something of a scandal, and it has to be. Because if you're a Protestant who takes your tradition seriously, then it seems to me, and it seemed to me then, that you're basically obliged to believe that Catholics are constantly engaging in blasphemous and idolatrous practices. In other words, as a Protestant, it seemed to me that you're obliged to believe not just that Catholics are wrong, but that they're engaged in blasphemies and idolatries. And what that means is that they're always engaging in things that should be cutting against the grain of their own holiness, cutting against the grain of their own relationship with Christ. And so the line that was often used is that Catholics could be Christians despite, but not because of their Catholicism. But when I got to Hillsdale and I met these Catholics, I learned that that was obviously not the case. That they're the Catholics who seem to show the love of Christ and the fruit of the Spirit the most. They were the Catholics who really loved Mary, who were really invested in going to Mass daily and participating in the sacrifice of the Mass. And as a Protestant, those are the very things that you would say are blasphemous or idolatrous. And so what do you do when the things that should be not conducive to holiness are actually making you more Christ-like? That forces you to reconsider some things. And the other thing that I would say about Catholic sanctity is that it takes away the hostility. You know, in my experience, you've talked to a lot of converts, and in my world, I've talked to a lot of converts as well. Most converts go through what I sometimes call like a first conversion, and the first conversion isn't to Catholicism, it's just you take down the hostility. Hostility is really the barrier that keeps a lot of Protestants from taking the claims of Catholicism seriously, and that was true for me. That it's not just that I didn't think Catholicism was true, I was actively hostile to it. I was sort of catechized to be hostile to it. And I don't blame my evangelical upbringing for that. I don't blame them, because given what they believe, they think it's good, right? They think that in order to be truly committed to the gospel, you basically need to be anti-Catholic. But once the hostility got taken down, then you become open to a number of arguments and claims that you might not have been open to before. But hostility, in my experience, is a kind of way that a lot of Protestants keep the claims of Catholicism at a kind of arm's length. And so by knowing Catholics who were good people, who had the virtues, and who were Christ-like, my hostility had to kind of melt away. And that, you know, created an opportunity for actually becoming sympathetic to the claims and eventually to agreeing with them.
So you get to a point where when you first start, you meet these Catholics, you think they have to be out to lunch. They're hopelessly lost in terms of their theology.
Yeah.
And then you start to see their lives, and then you become a little bit more open to who they are. But maybe you feel like who they are isn't because of their Catholicism, it's despite their Catholicism.
Right.
But then there's a moment where maybe you see how that's really connected, and then something triggers you where you think now, wow, they've got something that I don't have.
That's right. Yeah, and to that, I remember feeling quite early that the saints of the Catholic Church stood a little bit taller than my heroes in Protestantism. I remember one thing that my roommate and I joked about doing. So my roommate, Eric, his great hero, his confirmation saint that he took was actually St. John Paul II. And at the time, I was really into like my John Piper phase. John Piper is a very well-known figure in the evangelical world. He wrote this book called Desiring God, and has been very influential for a lot of Christians, and has done a lot of good things for a lot of Christians and helped their relationship with God, I think. But I was really into John Piper at the time, and my friend was really into John Paul II. And he joked that, well, you know what? Our heroes both have the initials JP. So what we should do is we should put this sign on the wall with a picture of John Piper and John Paul II, and above it, it should say, JP who? You know, like which JP you gonna go with? And I remember my immediate reaction to that was to say, no, we're not gonna do that. Because I was embarrassed at the contrast. Like I just knew intuitively that my hero, and John Piper is a good man. I don't have any, you know, I'm not trying to disparage him. He's not St. John Paul II. And I intuited that. I intuited that there was something about John Paul II that just stood larger, that just shined brighter, that was a bit more luminous and full. And I even got to a place where I realized by the time I was a senior in college, I realized that even though as a senior I wasn't Catholic yet, I had grown more sympathetic to it, but I was still firmly Protestant. I'm about to go to seminary. So before I started grad school at Duke, by the way, I went to seminary. We can get to that in a second. I dropped out, obviously, but I was still committed Protestant. And I remember realizing that if Eric had come up to me and said, you know what, you've persuaded me of, say, like justification by faith alone or something, by sola fide, or your position on authority, sola scriptura, so I'm going to become Protestant. I think even as a committed Protestant, as a senior in college, I would have tried to talk him out of it. Because I intuited that for Eric to become Protestant would mean a loss. Even if it meant knowing more of the truth, which is what I would have said. It's what I had to have said as a Protestant, that I possessed more of the truth than he did. There was something that he would have lost that would have been essential, that I would have like tried to talk him out of it. It would have seemed like a tragedy to me if he had stopped being Catholic.
Wow.
And so, yeah, I didn't have the words for it, but I definitely intuited there was a kind of fullness to Catholicism, and maybe a kind of fullness that I didn't have.
That's so interesting. I feel like there's such a powerful thing that happens when you meet a Catholic and all of your misconceptions, all of your stereotypes are blown up by seeing the Catholic life lived out in front of you.
That's right.
Because there's a lot of people who they think they know what Catholics believe and they think they know who Catholics are.
That's right.
But it's amazing to me how how wrong they can be sometimes.
Yeah, I gave the example of my Bible teacher, and again, this is an intelligent, like, pious man. He's no dummy, but his misconception is it's laughable, right? About the Pope is only infallible when he sits in a special chair, because he didn't know a single Catholic who could correct him on this. And so if you don't actually have those personal connections, it's really easy to run with just these wild misconceptions. And in fact, having those own misconceptions overturned, this was not just a humbling, I would call it a humiliating process. Because what I would do when I first started to get to know Eric, I would try to research how I could what do Catholics believe, because I wanted to know how I could sort of prove to him he was wrong. Because what I knew was that I believed the gospel of Jesus Christ. He believed in works righteousness or some sort of man-made blasphemous system. And it was in his best interest for his own soul that I persuade him out of it. So I would research what Catholics believe, and I'd always get it from a Protestant source. And I had a few sources I would go to, and what Bible verses would you use and things like this. And I started reading Protestant kind of responses to Catholicism. I read a lot of R.C. Sproul at the time. I don't know if that's a figure you're
Oh, I know.
with.
I love R.C. Sproul.
Yeah. So R.C. Sproul. In the 1990s, this group was created called Evangelicals and Catholics Together. That was started because evangelicals and Catholics, they said, well, look, we have theological differences, but we have a lot in common. And in our culture, it's especially important that we unite around our commonalities and what we share, because the culture is getting more secular. It's turning, it's becoming more and more hostile to the gospel. This is in the 90s, by the way, 30 years ago. And we need to unite around what joins us together. And so they came out with this statement about what they share in common. And it included a statement on justification. And the statement says there are points of disagreement between evangelicals and Catholics, but we do agree about all these other things. And R.C. Sproul wrote this whole book called Getting the Gospel Right, which is essentially a critique of the ECT, the Evangelical and Catholics Together Statement on Justification, because he accuses them of downplaying certain aspects of the Protestant notion, namely imputation, the idea that you're covered with Jesus' righteousness when you're justified. It's not given to you, it doesn't transform you. That's in sanctification. Justification just covers you. But the point being that I was reading stuff like this, right? I was reading these Protestant authors who were very invested in the idea that Catholicism wasn't just wrong, but a false gospel, and it is in their interest to convert them. So I started reading all this stuff, and I'd come to Eric and saying, I realize as a Catholic, you have to believe X, Y, and Z, and it's, hold up, I don't believe that. I would have to say, what do you mean you don't believe that? This is what you believe, isn't it? And we had a lot of conversations that started out that way, of me telling him what he believed, what I thought he believed, and him having to correct me. And it would take us a while to actually argue the theology, because first he had to just correct my own misconception, right? And I had done this for so long that at the end of my sophomore year, I had this little breakdown. Actually, it was either his birthday or my birthday, where at the end of sophomore year, Eric was my best friend at school, and we had a really great friendship, and I had learned a lot from him. And it really struck me that the past 2 years, the way I had treated him, this guy who had become my closest friend, it was just terrible. I had treated him horribly. I came to him assuming that I knew what he believed, and that I assumed that he needed what I had to give him. And I saw him as a kind of project. I did see him it wasn't just as a project, I did see him as a friend. We had a real friendship. But I realized that I did not treat him well. And when I remember just confessing this to him, apologizing, he's my roommate, right? And so you imagine these two 20-year-old college dudes and a roommate, and I'm just telling him how sorry I am. I start break down and crying, and I end up hugging him. And I start crying on his shoulder. He's taller than me. I'm only 5'8", right? So it's easy for me to cry on another man's shoulder. So I'm crying on his shoulder, and I start crying so hard that my nose started bleeding. And when I got up, there was this blood stain on his shirt. I've always remembered that. I think he probably remembers it too. But this moment happened because I felt so convicted about how I had treated him, that I was so sure that my misconceptions about Catholicism were the reality. And because of that, I needed to fix him. I needed to clear him up. I needed to give him what I had. And so it was through this, like I said, not just humbling, but almost humiliating process that these misconceptions were broken down. Now here I just want to flag something because I think it's interesting. Fast forward a few years later when I became Catholic, one of the hardest things for me to hear was when people would tell me, when they would give these same Catholic misconceptions back to me, certain Protestants, right? And they would say, no, Catholics believe X, Y, and Z. And it was all the same things that I used to say to Eric and that I only abandoned after being humbled through hours of conversation and friendship, right? And hearing them say things like, you think you know Catholicism better because you think you know everything. And these people just had no idea that I had only come to a more accurate understanding of Catholicism through this painful, humbling process. It wasn't because I thought I knew everything. It's because I had to realize I didn't know anything, that I first got to the point that I did. So even clearing up those misconceptions, it took a lot of time and pain.
Yeah, I can relate to that. There is that moment where you have this, like these, it's like a series of revelations where it feels like the lights are starting to go on and you're like becoming aware of things that you thought you knew for sure. But once you start to see the truth of the Catholic faith, things connect in ways that you think, how did I miss that?
That's right. That's right. And that's a big thing because when it comes to what persuaded me to become Catholic, it wasn't just that I was convinced of certain positions. That happened, obviously. I changed my mind about justification. I changed my mind about the Eucharist. But it was also that the whole picture of the Christian faith started to fit together more. So one thing that happened for me, for example, was I saw that I sort of saw that Catholicism seemed to me to be more Trinitarian. In other words, the way that Catholic life was structured in the liturgy and in the Mass in particular, it was Trinitarian through and through. It was about participating in the offering of the Son to the Father through the Spirit. That's the high point of the Christian life, is being caught up into the Trinity, that eternal triune relationship of self-gift and love, of the Son offering himself to the Father, and that's what the Eucharist allows you to do, is to participate in that self-offering to the Father through the work of the Spirit. And as an evangelical, I believed in the Trinity because I knew I had to, but the pieces didn't quite connect. I couldn't quite connect the doctrine of the Trinity to my day-to-day life, at least not very well. I couldn't quite connect the Trinity I couldn't quite explain why the Trinity mattered. It was true, the Bible teaches it, therefore you need to believe it. But Catholicism seemed to me Trinitarian top to bottom. The whole thing was about participating in the triune relations of the Godhead. And you know, what's interesting about that, though, Keith, is that I only cared about living a Trinitarian life because I had a youth pastor back at my non-denom Bible church who emphasized that. He would always encourage me to try to think Trinitarianly, right? To see how our belief that God is triune, Father, Son, and Spirit, this eternal communion of self-gift and love and glorification, that changes everything because that's our God. Right? If the Christian faith is ultimately about the kind of God we believe in and what God has done for us, believing in the Trinity should change everything. And this youth pastor, a very, very wise man whom I owe a lot, he was always encouraging me, like, be a Trinitarian Christian, right? Don't be a Unitarian. You're not a Unitarian. You believe in a Trinity, that God is a communion of self-giving love. And that fit far more deeply and neatly and profoundly into Catholicism, I saw. But the point is that I only cared about that because I was taught to care about it from my evangelical Bible church. They had laid the kind of foundations. It's like they had given me puzzle pieces that were great puzzle pieces, but they only fit in the kind of larger Catholic framework, if that makes sense.
So you're raised an evangelical in the Bible Belt, believing in Jesus, and it's when you get to college and you meet a Catholic guy who turns you on to these truths, and then eventually this Trinitarian reality starts smacking the face. And it sounds to me like these interactions with Catholics helped you understand things that had been taught to you as a Protestant.
Yeah.
But now you're starting to see them in a fuller way. That's kind of what I'm talking about with the lights beginning to go on.
That's exactly right.
And you go, whoa.
Yeah.
This is bigger than I realized. And it's like once you get a taste of that, it feels like you just want more and more and more.
That's exactly right.
Now, where in this process do you meet your wife?
Yeah, so I met my wife before school even started at Hillsdale. So we went on this retreat before school even started as freshmen. And that's where I met my wife, Shannon. And we became friends pretty quickly. And we were both, she was also raised evangelical. So we shared a lot in common. We were both English majors. We took classes together. And because we were both evangelicals, we shared our faith, right? So Shannon and I were friends from basically the get-go at Hillsdale. But we didn't start dating until the summer between my junior and senior year.
So when you started dating her, is this when you were still you talked about before your roommate situation, were you talking to her about the things that you were learning about Catholicism, or was that something that you didn't, maybe we were afraid to bring that up to her?
No, that's a good question. So it's funny, my roommate, one time Shannon asked Eric, because we're still good friends with Eric. He was my sponsor when I was confirmed, and his wife Danielle was Shannon's sponsor. We were confirmed together. But one time Shannon asked Eric, she said, "Did you ever think that Travis would become Catholic when you first met him?" And he said, "I thought there was a chance until he married you."
Oh.
Because Shannon was more anti-Catholic than I was.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought that when you two started dating and then got engaged and married, the hope of Travis becoming Catholic was gone. And so Shannon and I, we would talk about Catholicism a little bit. So Shannon had a similar experience on a kind of different trajectory because she also met devout pious Catholics. And so she met a girl in her sorority who is still a close friend of ours. She's Edith's godmother. Edith is my oldest child. She's her 9-year-old daughter. And her godmother is a very devout Catholic. And this godmother, Elizabeth, she was one of Shannon's sorority sisters at Hillsdale. So Shannon had also started to meet Christ-like holy Catholics. And so even though she was more anti-Catholic doctrinally, in other words, she was just more committed to the idea that Catholics have to be engaged in kind of blasphemous things, she still had to rub up against the reality of sanctified Catholic lives and the pressure that kind of puts on you, on your commitment to believing that they're engaged in blasphemies all the time, right? So she had a similar kind of experience, but not quite as radical as mine at the time. It wasn't really until we got married that then we really started to talk about this stuff more. Because while we were dating, I was set on becoming a pastor.
Yeah.
And I didn't question that. And she was very supportive of that. And so while we were dating, we didn't talk about the Catholic faith much, just insofar as it related to our friends. Like, we love our Catholic friends. They still believe some weird things, but So we didn't talk about it a lot. Not until we were married, at least.
So you guys get married. You're still thinking, I want to become a Protestant pastor. Like, when did you decide that you didn't want to be a pastor anymore? And was that connected to the whole Catholic thing?
Yes. So by the time that I graduated college, I was an unhappy evangelical. Now, when I say unhappy, I just mean dissatisfied with my theological commitments, but I didn't know what they were. I knew that the beliefs I had grown up regarding the sacraments especially, I knew those probably had to be wrong. So non-denominational Bible churchgoers, they believe what Baptists believe about the Eucharist and baptism, that baptism is purely an outward sign of an interior conversion that's happened. It's purely a symbol. They practice what they call believer's baptism, right? No infant baptism. It's just this outward expression of something that's already happened. And then regarding the Eucharist, they hold to what's often called a Zwinglian or a memorialist view of the Eucharist, which is that the Eucharist is purely symbolic. It's a memory. Jesus commands it, so you do it, you obey, right? But it's not... it doesn't participate in a higher supernatural reality. It's not the presence of our Lord. And other Protestants believe things that are a bit closer to Catholicism, right? There are certain Protestants who believe that the Eucharist is the body and blood of Christ. But as a Baptist or a non-denominational evangelical, you're basically as far from the sacramental scale of Catholics as you can get. My point here is that when I first started reading in the tradition, one thing that I was exposed to at Hillsdale was reading things like the Church Fathers and the Medievals. And it became clear to me very fast that none of them believed the things that I believed about the Eucharist and baptism. Those were two of the first evangelical beliefs that really kind of took a hit. And I was fairly convinced that those had to be wrong, those evangelical beliefs regarding the Eucharist and baptism. But I wasn't ready to jump ship. I didn't believe in Catholic dogma about the Pope or about Mary or about the priesthood, about a lot of things. And so I thought, well, maybe I should be some kind of higher church Protestant, but what is that? I'm not even sure if I believe in infant baptism, right? And so when I say unhappy evangelical, I mean, I'm just dissatisfied theologically with the tradition in which I'd been raised, but I didn't know where else to go, because it was my home tradition.
Yeah.
And so I ended up going to Dallas Theological Seminary after I graduated from Hillsdale, not because I knew that I agreed with everything that was going on there, but because I didn't know where else to go. And I didn't know, am I supposed to go to, I'm not an Anglican. I can't just go to some Anglican seminary. I'm not Presbyterian, right? I didn't know what to do. And so I thought, well, you know what? I'm just going to go back to the thing I've always known. And my pastors at my home church all went to Dallas Theological Seminary. It's kind of hard to explain for those who may not understand, but Dallas Seminary has something of like a hegemonic influence in the Bible Belt in terms of like the number of pastors it cranks
sure.
out. And it's thought of as being kind of like the Harvard of evangelical seminaries. Like it's the prestigious one. That if you want to go to the most prestigious sort of evangelical seminary that will teach you how to interpret scripture and get your biblical languages, you go to DTS. It's really prestigious in a lot of circles, actually. And so I thought that's what I grew up knowing. That was the thing to do, and so it's what I'm going to do now. And so I ended up going to DTS. And it was at DTS where I realized that far more sort of mental furniture had shifted in my mind than I had thought. And so when I was at DTS, I was taking a number of classes. And at seminary, you know, you've been to seminary, you don't just take classes about like the Bible and theology, you also take like pastoral ministries classes.
Yeah.
And I hated my pastoral ministries classes. And so my first discernment wasn't immediately into Catholicism. It was realizing that I didn't want to be a pastor and that I just wanted to be a professor. Now, here, what I think is interesting about this is actually that this isn't that discontinuous with what I first thought when I was 14. When I was 14, what I knew was that I loved thinking about God and about Jesus and about the Bible and about the faith. And I loved talking to people about them. And I still do. And I do that as a theology professor. I had the specifics wrong, right? But you can talk to people about God. You can think about God. You can spend your time reading and writing about God and not be a pastor. There's a whole other job, namely being a theologian, where you get paid to do that, right? And so what's interesting to me about that is that when I realized I don't think I was called to be a pastor, I should just be I should just get my PhD and be a professor, that wasn't radically discontinuous. That's what I discerned when I was 14. I was on to something then. I think that I really did intuit God's will for me, you could say. I had the specifics wrong. It wasn't to be a pastor, but I did know what I loved and I think what I was called to do, which is to spend time contemplating, thinking about, reading and writing about, and teaching about God and the Christian faith. So my first discernment was really out of pastoral ministry into academia. And once that was clear to me, it was clear that I didn't have to stay at DTS because I no longer had the worry of like, what tradition seminary do I have to go to? Right?
Yeah.
Whose denominational stamp of approval do I need? It was, what's the best theological education I can get? Like what will get me into good graduate programs, which will then get me a job. And so then after one semester at DTS, I dropped out. And the next fall, I enrolled at Duke. Because after researching a lot about theological graduate programs, Duke seemed to me to have really a good combination of a good Bible faculty, good history of Christianity faculty, and there were a couple Catholic theologians there as well who I wanted to study with.
So, did you keep in touch with your buddy Eric this whole entire time, or because
I did.
So when you were at Hillsdale, of course, you were with him quite a bit.
That's right.
But when you started going away, at what point did you get married?
August of 2013. So right before I started seminary.
Okay, so you're married at this time to an evangelical, anti-Catholic woman. You aren't with your Catholic buddy anymore, so you'd think that maybe that's going to be it for you into your Catholic journey. But obviously, it wasn't. So
No.
how did that?
Right.
How did that loop close?
That's right. So one sign that I was not happy at DTS is that I would fly through the assignments I'd been given. And one thing that I was very unhappy with at Dallas Seminary was I felt like I wasn't getting as good of a theological education actually as I had been getting at Hillsdale, where I wasn't even studying theology. But what I was exposed to at Hillsdale was the tradition of Christian thought, like the church fathers, medievals, all this philosophy, theology. And at Dallas Seminary, I would ask upperclassmen, people who were in their third, fourth year of the seminary, I say upperclassmen like it was high school, but older students there, I would ask them for their course syllabi to see what they would read. And there was almost nothing from the tradition. It was really a kind of immersion into the greatest hits of kind of 20th and 21st century dispensational evangelical theology. There was really nothing, very, very, very little from the tradition. And so what I would do is I would race through my assignments at DTS, and then I would go home and read, I would read the Church Fathers, I would read Thomas Aquinas, and then I also discovered Catholic theologians like Joseph Ratzinger or Benedict XVI. There were other Catholic theologians I discovered as well. And it was through this process that I became more and more convinced of Catholic views on certain things like the sacraments. A big one for me was justification, right? Because Luther thought this was the thing. Martin Luther once said that if the Pope would confess the doctrine of justification by faith alone, he would bend down on his knees and kiss his hand. Luther gives some indication that he would have dropped the whole thing if only for the issue of justification, right? Pope, Mary, fine, just get justification right. And so it seemed to me as a Protestant that if justification is the most important issue, and the Catholics get that one right too, then what else do they get right? All these other things that I've been holding at arm's length, like Mary, the papacy, things like that. I was also somewhat idiosyncratic as a Protestant. So one of my favorite authors as a Protestant was C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis is a bit idiosyncratic. C.S. Lewis in one of his books argues for purgatory. And he had convinced me of that. So actually, as an evangelical at Dallas Seminary, I believed in purgatory.
Wow. Usually that's the last thing to fall for a Protestant becoming
Really?
Catholic.
It seemed to me so intuitive. The way Lewis explains it, it's quite simple. It's that, look, the Bible's very clear that no evil or sin can abide the presence of God. And unless you're a saint, which most of us aren't, when you die, you're imperfect. So there's still cleansing to be done. Therefore, when you die, there's some process whereby the final purging, right, the final cleansing of the dross has to happen. And it seemed to me obvious, right? It followed from a biblical logic. And I thought, and C.S. Lewis was someone that I had I had serious respect for. I still do. My oldest son, by the way, John Henry, his middle name is Lewis, after C.S. Lewis. So even as a Catholic, I still have a lot of respect for C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis had convinced me of purgatory. Amazing. And so I was already kind of idiosyncratic, I guess, as a Protestant. Yeah, so things like purgatory, justification, the sacraments. And eventually what I realized was that I could always invent one new objection to Catholicism, right? Even if you solve the Mary issue, well, then what about relics? Okay, let's say you get over relics. Okay, then what about the papacy? You get over the papacy. Well, then what about, like, indulgences? There's always one more objection you can raise, unless you deal with the question of authority. If the church has the authority to infallibly interpret Scripture, then all of my objections to it become moot. It's just like my faith in the authority of the Bible, that not only do I believe that the Bible teaches X, Y, and Z, I am theoretically open to believing anything should I be convinced the Bible teaches it. Mm-hmm. That's what my faith in the Bible is like. And if the church has a similar kind of authority to interpret the Bible infallibly, then my objections are that's irrelevant. If the church has the authority to teach it, then my job then is to submit, not to keep inventing new objections. So once I started thinking about the question of what is the church, and does the church have this kind of authority, I realized that was the central issue I had to wrestle with. And if the church does have that authority, then any of my other objections, such as like the assumption of Mary, and I'll be honest, it's not like when I became Catholic, I had been argued into like the bodily assumption of Mary into heaven. What I was convinced of was the authority of the church. And so that regardless of my objections, I just had to submit, right? And so it was attending to that issue that was really the kind of final domino to fall. And there's a bunch of other things going on during this time. I mentioned I was an English major at Hillsdale. I was also reading a lot of Catholic literature. There's a bunch of beautiful Catholic novels by Graham Greene, Evelyn Waugh, Sigrid Undset, Walker Percy, Francois Mauriac, Nobel Prize winner. Undset was also a Nobel Prize winner. I could go on and on. But the power of Catholic beauty was starting to make itself felt on me. The Catholic tradition of art and music. Even Protestantism has a lot of great composers like Bach, Beethoven, but a lot of their most beautiful compositions are mass settings. And so the power of Catholicism to generate transcendent works of beauty was starting to really impress itself on me. And I also started to get to know the saints more. So I read like George Weigel's biography of John Paul II, Witness to Hope. It's this huge tome. And I had surgery on my ACL when I was at DTS. And when I was recovering from surgery, I was in bed for 12 hours a day. I just read through the biography of John Paul II. I started reading about Mother Teresa. So it was this combination of things. There were these intellectual arguments and battles that I was having, but I was also starting to learn more about the saints, becoming more sort of enchanted by them. And I was also becoming more taken by the beauty produced by the Catholic tradition. And all these things collectively kept working on me and working on me.
Now, were you talking to Eric about this stuff as it was happening? Were you talking to Shannon about this stuff as it's happening, or are you trying to process it by yourself?
I'm talking to Shannon a little bit. So the way that I was talking, I'm not talking to Eric. To answer that question, I'm not talking to Eric about this. But Shannon, I wouldn't talk to her so much about my attraction to Catholicism as I would my disgruntlement with various aspects of Protestantism. And so what Shannon and I had both done, Shannon and I had both sort of journeyed out of not evangelicalism necessarily, but like low church, like Baptist evangelicalism. Yeah. And when we got to DTS, we actually started attending an Anglican church. So we had sort of made this journey into a kind of a more liturgical Protestantism together. And so we would talk about our love of like the sacraments, you know, and the Eucharist and a more liturgical mode of life. And we would, you know, we put up icons in our first apartment, and you know, Anglicans have icons, right? And so, but these are habits that can be, if you're not careful, Catholicizing as well, right? So Shannon and I are talking about this kind of thing. We're sort of becoming more Catholic without explicitly becoming more Catholic. We think of ourselves as becoming just more like high church, more Anglican, I guess. And the final nail in the coffin was when our Anglican church started having confirmation. Shannon really wanted us to get confirmed because from her attitude, she was really happy in this sort of higher liturgical mode of the Christian faith that didn't have the baggage of Mary and the Pope, but all the other bells and whistles that Catholicism had, this beautiful liturgy and the Book of Common Prayer is gorgeous if you've ever read it, you know, and this higher sacramental kind of vision. And I would always sort of hem and haw about, yeah, well, we'll see, confirmation would be nice. And I was always super non-committal about it. But then come Easter, this is spring of 2014. So at this time, I'm not at DTS. I was only at DTS for one semester, the fall semester. That spring, I was working full time. So during Easter 2014, on Holy Saturday, Shannon really wanted to go to an Easter vigil, a Catholic Easter vigil, because we had heard from our Catholic friends at Hillsdale that it's one of the most beautiful liturgies, most beautiful services in Christianity. And our Anglican church didn't have any Holy Saturday liturgy. And I was against it at first simply because I had heard it was so long. You know, I think I remember my response being, isn't that like 3 hours long? Let's stay home and watch Remember the Titans instead, right? I was like, this is like a 3-hour liturgy. Can we just stay home and watch a movie? She really wanted to go, and she said, well, I think I'm going with her without you. And I was like, well, I'm not going to make you go alone to the Easter Vigil. So we go to an Easter Vigil, and little did I know that that was super powerful for Shannon. Because the next day, so this is Easter Sunday 2014, we're driving home from our Easter Sunday service at our Anglican church, and Shannon turns to me and says, are you being non-committal about confirmation because you think we should be Catholic? And it was really then that I admitted it to myself. Because I hadn't even admitted it to myself at that point, Keith. I was becoming more and more sympathetic with Catholicism. My objections were becoming weaker and weaker, so much so that I was sort of getting annoyed with them, right? I like the objections that I had would seem to me so just weak and incapable. But I just couldn't admit to myself that I actually wanted to become Catholic and thought that Catholicism was true, because I thought that Shannon would be against it. And I thought that, well, I can't go there, she can't go there. And I also knew that becoming Catholic would cause a massive amount of friction with our families. And so that just wasn't a bridge I was just going to daintily skip over, right? I wasn't just going to do that casually. And so I couldn't even admit it to myself. But when Shannon asked me, she said, are you being non-committal about confirmation because you think we should be Catholic? It was really that moment, that card, when I admitted it to myself that I said, yes. And she said, great, me too.
Wow.
And we've basically been Catholic since.
Well, I want to get into a little bit about this situation with your families,
right,
because, you know, I come from a family of non-Catholics too, and
that's right.
I understand how that can go, and I know that that's where your families still are.
That's right.
What was that like? And had you talked to them at all about the things that you were learning and your discontentment, and had you given any clues to either her family or your family about this idea of becoming Catholic, or when it happened, was it just completely out of left field?
The only clues were that we were attending an Anglican church. We weren't Baptist, we weren't non-denominational. That was weird, you know. And so mainline Protestantism is so uncommon in Oklahoma that when I told my parents we were attending an Anglican church, they said, well, how's that different from being Catholic? And I share that not to like say my parents are ignorant or something, but just to show how far out afield it is from their day-to-day experience.
Yeah.
They don't meet any Anglicans, they don't meet any Catholics. And so becoming Anglican was a bit exotic. Attending an Anglican church was a bit exotic, but I think both families thought that it's Protestant though, right? And it's safe. Maybe it's a phase, it's a fad, something like that. So that was a bit weird, but they weren't worried about it. Leaving seminary was also a bit weird because, as I mentioned, Dallas Seminary had such this reputation, especially in Oklahoma, that it was sort of unfathomable that any devout evangelical could go and be unhappy there or find it inadequate in some sense. And so I think my parents were very taken aback by my decision to leave Dallas Seminary. They thought the Anglicanism thing was a little bit weird, but I wasn't talking to them about these other things. They had no other sense of that. It was a bit out of left field. And to this day, I sometimes wonder, like, should I have said more? And one reason that I think I was afraid to sort of involve them in the process, both, all family members in the process, is that it was precisely in my time at Hillsdale when I was becoming more sympathetic to Catholicism but didn't yet agree with it, that the hostility to Catholicism really weighed on me. And I really experienced this through certain pastors that I would have that, they would say, you're best friends with like a Catholic, right? I said, yeah, you need to be careful with that. They believe X, Y, and Z. And I would always retort. I would say, well, actually, they don't believe that. And they were like, what? Aren't you on my side? I'm like, no, I am on your side, but you just got Catholicism wrong. And what I learned in those last couple of years, where you could say I'm Catholic, hospitable, but not convinced, was that the animosity to Catholicism was so great, is that most Protestants, even good devout Protestants, these are good men and women, people who love Jesus, who love God, who have good prayer lives. There's something within the kind of DNA that makes certain Protestants not want to have their misconceptions cleared up. They want the hostility. They kind of almost need Catholicism to be this big boogeyman that they think it is. And I had become so convinced of that through my time at Hillsdale, of trying to talk to these pastor friends of mine that actually you've got Catholicism wrong. They don't believe X, Y, and Z. It's more like this, actually. And there's no. Like my version is right. Like the bad version is right.
Yeah.
I was so sort of turned off by that I was always afraid of just generating those conversations, of just running into more, of just being looked at weird, like, well, why are you defending the Catholics? And again, my attitude at the time was, I'm not like agreeing with them. I'm just saying you don't have their views right. So if you're going to criticize them, at least get the position right. I was so sort of turned off by that experience that I was kind of afraid to involve them. So I do sometimes wonder about that, was that not giving them enough credit? Because I think it's important to look back on our own histories and not make ourselves the hero at every single moment. There are moments that I could have done better, that I perhaps could have proceeded more prudently. So no, they weren't included in the process.
So how'd you tell them?
So we told the two families a little bit differently. One family we told over the course of a dinner. The other family we told through an email, which that was another decision that was hard to make because the family that we told through an email was the family that we knew would probably take it harder. And the reason we chose an email was because it seemed impersonal. That was the downside of email, right? It seems like you're not taking it very seriously or something, or it could just seem impersonal. We knew that it had that downside, but what we didn't want to do was to spring it on them in conversation. We're becoming Catholic, react. We knew that would go terribly.
Yeah.
And so we emailed that family. And again, was that the right decision? I don't know. But I knew I wanted to avoid the spring it on them. But the other family we told over the course of dinner. And both families are pretty upset. It was the hardest thing I've done in my life is become Catholic. Because it created so much tension. And it made people that I love deeply and who loved me deeply, who loved me then and still love me now. It caused them a lot of pain and a lot of grief and a lot of hurt. And it's the kind of thing that I couldn't have done unless I was convinced I had to do it. Becoming Catholic wasn't just something that I wanted to do. It became something that I was convinced I had to do because it was true. And my duty was to follow Jesus where he led, and he was leading me to become Catholic. And so if it hadn't been, I have to do this to obey our Lord, there's no way I could have done it. I couldn't have caused that kind of pain to my loved ones. So it was hard.
Yeah, that's tough. That's tough. Has it gotten any better over the years?
Yes. Time heals a lot of wounds. Grandchildren also heal a lot of wounds.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing too is they've probably seen how this has played out in your life. And I want to get to that too. Like,
Yeah, sure.
what's life been like for you as a Catholic? As a Protestant,
Yeah.
sometimes we can fantasize about what it'll be like, and maybe it's that way,
Yeah.
maybe it's not. What's it been like for you? Just the experiential part
Sure.
of being Catholic.
Yeah. Before we move on to that, there is one thing that I want to be sure to say real quick,
Sure.
though, is that, I mentioned a couple times how things that were puzzle pieces that were sort of put on the table as a kid at my church growing up were essential to me becoming Catholic, the whole Trinitarian thing. And I could give more examples. I had that same youth pastor who was interested in being a Trinitarian Christian. He also loved the biblical image of adoption. And in the Council of Trent's Declaration on Justification, it talks about justification in the language of adoption. It's that act whereby we're transferred from being sons of darkness into being sons of God, right? And so my sympathy to the Catholic position on justification, it really had its roots in this youth pastor who taught me to love the biblical image of adoption, that salvation is becoming a son of God, right? Not just having this external imputed covering. You become a son of God. What Jesus has by nature, you have by grace. I share that to say that I viewed then, and I still think now, that I became Catholic because of the things my parents and my home church gave me. That I saw then, and I still see now, Catholicism as the flourishing, the outgrowth of that foundation that they gave me. Obviously, it was a rejection of certain details, right? Yes, I rejected the evangelical view of the Eucharist. Yes, I changed my mind, like about Mary and justification. But in much more deeper, profound ways, I think it's a story of continuity, not discontinuity. And so I think one of the painful things about becoming Catholic was that my attitude about becoming Catholic and like my parents and my home church is nothing but gratitude. I wouldn't have become Catholic if it wasn't for their wisdom. They were wise enough to plant those seeds that flourished into Catholicism, and I wouldn't have done it if that wasn't there. So I owe them, I really believe this, I owe my Catholicism to my parents and my home church, actually, in a weird kind of way. And they wouldn't see it that way. They would see that as almost delusional,
I totally get it, though.
One of the hard things about becoming Catholic and seeing the pain it caused is that for a lot of loved ones, it was taken as a rejection. You're rejecting what I gave you. And, and it's natural in these moments when you disagree with someone you love for them to take it personally, right? But I just, there's no way I could convince them then. And I wonder if I could convince them now, like, no, even if you think I'm delusional, I thank you. Like, I view this as like, I owe this to you. I wouldn't have done this without you. That's like, you are the instrument through whom God's grace worked so that I could someday become Catholic.
That's an interesting thing that I've seen happen with Catholic converts versus people who leave the Catholic Church.
That's right.
A lot of Catholic converts from Protestantism can look back on their Protestant upbringing, and they can appreciate and be thankful for what they gleaned from that as the foundational aspect of the thing that led them to Catholicism. Whereas when it switched around, you hear a lot of people who leave the Catholic Church become Protestants. They look back on their Catholic upbringing and they hate it.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean,
that's right.
The most famous thing whenever you hear someone say, "Oh, I was raised Catholic," but you're typically going to get
That's right.
an avalanche of garbage after that.
That's right.
But it's never the other way. I find
right.
that people who are Protestant who become Catholic are able to see how that foundation is what opened them to the very idea of who is God and what does it mean to follow and serve and know Him. And they recognize Catholicism to be the fullness of what they had received.
Yeah.
Whereas people who leave the Catholic Church out of bitterness or anger or whatever, they have to reject all of that and start with a completely different foundation. It's very interesting.
No, that's exactly right, Keith. And that's something I noticed quite early on. Was that the nature of the Tiber is a two-way river, right? There are Catholics who then become Protestant, Protestants who become Catholic, but there's a kind of asymmetry. And one of the asymmetries is exactly what you just mentioned, that there is often a kind of resentment, it seems to me, of the Protestants who were raised Catholic because they didn't encounter the true gospel of Jesus Christ, they believe, and they were denied like a living relationship with God. And maybe they were in some sense. Maybe their priest, their church, they weren't catechized, all sorts of things. There may have been a lot of mistakes the church made, and maybe even their loved ones made. but there's a kind of resentment there.
Yeah.
Or at the very least, there's an absence of real gratitude, right? But with the Catholics, absolutely. And I noticed that even as a Protestant, and that was interesting to me. Another sort of asymmetry in the kind of two-way street of the Tiber, right, or to mix metaphors, was that I noticed that the Catholics who became Protestant were Catholics who, when they were Catholic, were not super into being Catholic.
Right.
They didn't know their faith, and they weren't happy as Catholics. They weren't happy Catholics. But when I got to Hillsdale, at Hillsdale it's not uncommon. There's actually every year there's a whole group of Protestants who convert while they're at Hillsdale. And what I noticed is that the Protestants who became Catholic were Protestants who knew their faith, who loved their faith, and who were not like traumatized by their faith. They had good experiences in it. Yet somehow Catholicism was even able to seem more appealing still. Because look, it's not difficult to explain. Why would someone leave a tradition they're dissatisfied with, that doesn't feed them spiritually, intellectually, whatever, for a tradition that does? It's like the answer's obvious, right?
Yeah.
It's obvious. That doesn't require an explanation. The phenomenon that requires an explanation is, why would you leave a tradition that does feed you, right? That does nurture those depths of you that you are happy with? And that was something I couldn't explain as a Protestant. How is it that Catholicism seems attractive even to knowledgeable, devout, faithful Protestants?
Well, the reason why, I think, is because it's not that because you mentioned earlier that you became dissatisfied in Protestantism, but it wasn't because you were questioning whether God was real or anything like that.
That's right.
It was you were recognizing that there had to be more fullness of this truth.
That's exactly right, yeah.
And that's a distinction between people who leave Catholicism and they're like, oh, it's all a bunch of lies.
Right.
Protestants don't typically do that. There are Catholics, but the Protestants that become Catholics don't typically do that. They go, I left Protestantism to find a fuller truth.
That's right.
Not because I'm being lied to and I don't have the real gospel.
That's exactly right. No, so yeah, I agree with you entirely. What I couldn't make sense of it when I was a Protestant. If you're going to be Protestant, how do you make sense of the fact that even devout, knowledgeable Protestants, and also what I would learn later was, it's not uncommon for Protestant theologians to convert. There's a lot of fairly well-known Catholic theologians, Bruce Marshall, Paul Griffiths, Reinhard Hooter, Mickey Maddox, who's a Martin Luther scholar. You have Protestant theologians, scholars of like Martin Luther and Reformed thought, who still become Catholic. These people know Protestantism, they know the Protestant tradition, and they become Catholic. I don't know of a single Catholic theologian or scholar of Thomas Aquinas who, because of his study of Thomas Aquinas, then became Protestant.
Right.
But Protestants who are scholars of Martin Luther do actually become Catholic. I couldn't explain that asymmetry as a Protestant. But yeah, that was something that I couldn't quite explain then, and I think that's exactly right. You know, one thing that you just said that I want to touch on as well is this issue of it's not like an existential crisis, because that was one response I got when I started to explain to loved ones, to pastors, to friends why I'm becoming Catholic. One common response was, I think there's something deeper you're not confronting. Like, there's no way you're becoming Catholic because you've calmly, rationally, prayerfully considered the truth and have come to this conclusion.
Right.
Because Catholicism is too crazy. Right? What's really going on is you're having this deeper crisis of faith. And so like a midlife crisis, like a husband who leaves his wife of 30 years to get with his hot young secretary and buys a sports car to make his drab life seem fun again. That's what you're doing. You're taking your unhappy, sort of middle-aged, as it were, soul,
right,
and giving it this fancy new coat of paint and colors and the hot young wife, right, with the Catholic faith. It's that I had this deeper existential issue I wasn't confronting. And I even had a family member tell me, because I asked one family member, I said, this is hurting you so badly. I'm a Christian. I believe in Jesus, that he died and rose for us. Would you rather have I become an atheist? And this person said no. And I'm not sure I believed them then. Because then they said, I think that you're going to become one though. This is clearly the first step in you just losing your faith entirely, because this isn't true Christianity, right? And that was one explanation we got. This is an existential crisis. And I don't blame them for responding this way, because given their presuppositions, it makes sense. Again, to refer to my son, John Henry, if John Henry came to me at the age of 23, which is how old I was when I came to my parents and told them I was becoming Catholic. If John Henry came to me at the age of 23 and said, Dad, I'm becoming a Scientologist, I don't know how I would respond, but I would say, son, there's something deeper you're not confronting. Like if John Henry were to say, Dad, I have calmly, prayerfully, and soberly attended to the evidence, and I've just concluded Scientology has to be real. I would say, that's not what happened. There's something else going on, right? Why would I say that? It's because I am convinced, and I think rightly, that Scientology is so crazy that you only go from being a Catholic to a Scientologist if something deeper is going on. It can't be a calm consideration of the evidence.
Right.
That would make you more Catholic, right? And so the only way you could abandon this full, satisfying religious tradition for a hokey one is if there's something else. You must be having some deeper crisis of faith and you're not addressing it. And what Scientology is to me now, Catholicism is to Protestants, a lot of them. It's so crazy, it's so out to lunch that the only way you could possibly become one is if there's something deeper, there's something else. And so I had a lot of these kinds of explanations. So one explanation I was given was the existential crisis. Another one was kind of the trauma explanation. You must have had a bad experience, right? You've been traumatized and you're not dealing with it, right? And you can't just leave just because you've had a traumatic experience. And I'd say, no, that's not it at all. But again, given their presuppositions, I understand why they made those responses. Because from their point of view, Catholicism is too crazy to accept on the evidence. There has to be something else.
There has to be something else.
So I got a lot of that. I got a lot of the, you were sort of brainwashed at Hillsdale College. One line I got was that at Hillsdale, they filled your mind. I've always remembered this phrase, with philosophical garbage and esoteric BS. I was sort of brainwashed, if you will. So I got a lot of kind of interesting explanations other than the ones that I gave. But again, like I said, I don't blame them for that. Given what their presuppositions are, that's how I would respond if my son became a Scientologist. There's something else.
There's something else.
It can't just be a consideration of the truth, a prayerful consideration of the truth. It can't be that. It's got to be something else.
Right.
So I get it.
It's really hard to try to explain this to people who have that mindset that you love. And I remember when this happened to me, I felt like I can't explain this to them. I just have to show them.
Right.
And part of that was just living the Catholic life.
That's right.
Living my faith. And hopefully they would see in me that I was committed to Christ, that I was more full of joy.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it always works that way. I know it worked with some people.
Sure.
But what about you? Like when you're actually, when you become Catholic, you start living the Catholic life. What did that feel like to you?
Yeah, being Catholic it's been wonderful. I've never regretted it. I've never been tempted to regret it or think I made the wrong decision for a day.
Have you ever had a moment where you see the crisis going on in the church and all the things that everybody gets worked up about and thought, maybe I should become Eastern Orthodox or go back to being Protestant? Like, has it ever happened to you?
No. Because, again, Keith, one of the things that convinced me of Catholicism was that it was God's church. It had been given a special grace by the Holy Spirit. Now the Holy Spirit uses imperfect human means to govern her church. But nevertheless, the ship stays afloat. G.K. Chesterton has that famous line that, I know the Catholic Church must be divine because no purely human institution could survive such comic mismanagement, right? And when I became Catholic, that was my position, right? That, I was very well acquainted with the bad the bad actors in Catholic history, bad bishops, bad popes, embarrassing things the Catholic Church has done. There were a lot of abuses that caused the Reformation, right? Martin Luther wasn't just, some kid looking to disagree with mom and dad just because out of teenage rebellion. There were legitimate abuses going on. Oh, I say legitimate. There were legitimate gripes in response to abuses that were going on. So I knew that going in. And what's remained with me, the conviction I had then, the conviction I had now, is that the gates of hell will not prevail. That doesn't mean the water doesn't get stormy. That doesn't mean that some of the human beings that the Holy Spirit uses aren't radically imperfect. But the gates of hell will not prevail. So no, I've never once regretted it.
Have you and your wife, when you guys were both going through this together, I can imagine this was sort of something that would drive you even closer together.
Yeah.
Because you were all each other had at that moment.
That's right. We were all each other had, and we were all each other had, plus Eric and plus Elizabeth, the two I mentioned earlier, and a couple others. But by and large, we felt alone. We felt very, very alone. And that absolutely did drive us close together. And this goes back to your question about what it's like living as a Catholic.
Yeah.
Shannon and I were really captivated immediately by Catholic piety, right? By Catholic prayer life. The church just has this treasury of prayers and devotions and ways to direct you to direct your mind and your heart to our Lord and to form you after the image of Christ. And so becoming Catholic has been so full, so abundant, so joyful. Now, that doesn't mean the life has been easy. Like I said, the issue with family alone made it very much not easy. But it's been full. It's been abundant. I wouldn't have my children if I hadn't become Catholic.
Wow.
Because Protestants, there is no Protestant denomination that formally condemns contraception, right? There are individual Protestants who have that conviction, but there is no denomination that out and out says don't do this, right? So, Shannon and I, at least maybe not Shannon. I think Shannon was open to having kids before I was, but I was of the opinion no kids until after grad school. Just can't be done. But then we became Catholic, and then things are much harder to control. And the second year of my master's program, Edith was born, and then in my PhD program, John, Henry, and Drew were born. And yeah, I wouldn't have my children if I wasn't Catholic. And that's an argument you have to be careful with, right? Because you don't want like a man who commits adultery and then impregnates his mistress say, oh, I just have to look at the child I conceived with my mistress, and I know that was the right thing to do.
Right.
Right. You can't use the ends justify the means. But at the same time, it's hard not to look at my children and think like this has to be a sign that this was the right thing to do. Right.
Well,
it's hard not to go that way. Even though what I just said, you have to be careful with that line of reasoning. Absolutely, having children was due to becoming Catholic. And yeah, like I said, we've grown to love the Mass. Catholic devotion, the Catholic saints alone are a rich treasury that you come to know them more and more, and they help you become more conformed to Christ. And so, yeah, becoming Catholic it hasn't always been easy, but it has always been full. It's been abundant.
From your perspective, what do you think most Catholics are missing, if anything? I mean, a lot of times converts get this. We have this reputation for being like on fire.
Sure.
And a lot of cradle Catholics go, oh, the converts are so on fire.
Sure.
And I think that can be true.
Yeah.
But, sometimes I look at different types of people in the church and I think, man, if only they knew this, and a lot of it has to do with where I came from.
Yeah.
And I realize sometimes that being a convert is a blessing because you can appreciate things that you didn't always have.
Yeah.
What's something in your life that you look at and you feel like you need to appreciate this more?
Sure. So I think for me, a big one of late has been the sacrifice of the Mass. So in the Catholic Church and in Catholic circles, we talk a lot about belief in the real presence of Jesus, like transubstantiation, that the Eucharist really is the body and blood of Christ, and that is obviously super important. But there's another piece to the puzzle that's also really important, and that the Eucharist is a participation in the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross to the Father. And this goes back to the point I made about the Trinity, right? Because it's precisely when we see that the Eucharist is a participation in Jesus' sacrifice, his sacrificial act, his glorification of the Father, and that we get to participate in that you really see that the Mass and Catholic life is about nothing less than being woven into the eternal triune life of God. That who our God is self-giving, glorious, communicating love. The Father giving himself and his own life to the Son, and the Son with the Son giving their life to the Spirit, and them returning the gift of the Spirit to each other, the Father and the Son. That we are invited into that eternal gift exchange, that exchange of love, of glory and gift. And when you see that the Eucharist is a sacrifice, it's how you participate in that act, in that love, in that gift, in that self-offering that the Son is eternally making to the Father. The cross is sort of it's sort of the beam that transports you into that, right? The Eucharist is that. And I think that's really important to get. That it's not just that the Eucharist is the real body and blood of Jesus. It is. But it is the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. And that's so important because then you see that it's about nothing less than being invited into the eternal life of the triune God. And that to me, once I saw that, it's not just that any potential temptation to think that Protestantism had it right was gone. It's that anything else just seemed undesirable. Why would I want to believe anything less other than that through the sacrament I can be woven into the very eternal, glorious, gift-giving, self-communicating life of God? What else would you want?
Wow, that's amazing.
And so the sacrifice of the Eucharist is really important, I think, and that's one that I think it's hard now because I think that especially in our modern world, the notion of sacrifice is really difficult. Because I think when a lot of modern listeners hear the word sacrifice, they think of the idea of like propitiating some angry storm god, right? So let's say you're a farmer in the ancient world and you want a good harvest, so you sacrifice 5 cattle to the storm god, saying, "Please don't destroy my crops." Right? I need you not to destroy my crops. So it's sort of in this fear and trembling, trying to satisfy the wrath of the angry God. So you sacrifice something in order to get the God on your side. And that's, I think, how most people think of what sacrifice is. But in Catholicism, in Christianity, and a lot of the Bible unpacks this very idea, sacrifice is about totality of self-gift. You know, a sacrifice is a total gift of yourself. And so I think that the idea of sacrifice is difficult for a lot of people to stomach because it sounds pagan or very Old Testament-ish maybe, right? But it's really important to see that that's who God is, total self-gift. And so if you want to participate in that self-gift, you need the Eucharist to be a sacrifice. And you need to be able to participate in it so that you could participate in that self-gift of the Son to the Father through the Spirit, that eternal gift exchange of love.
Wow. That's true. I wanted to ask you one more question about that. You know, I asked you what do you think most Catholics are missing or that you wish that they could appreciate more.
Sure.
What is it that you wish that non-Catholics could understand about the Catholic faith?
It's a great question. Everything? No, one thing. Honestly, this might sound kind of cookie cutter, but I wish it would be justification. Because that's the big one.
Yeah.
Because the great objection that most Protestants make to Catholics is that you think you have to earn Jesus' love, right? That Jesus' gift on the cross isn't enough. You got to add to it. It wasn't enough. It didn't fully do the job. So you've got to make up the difference by working and working and working and hoping that you can merit the love and the salvation of God. And one thing that I learned at Hillsdale, actually, digging into kind of the Reformation debates on justification, is that that's not it. That the real disagreements between Catholics and Protestants, it's not about earning versus non-earning the love of God or the salvation of God. It's about a couple things, but one of them is this question of how is Jesus' righteousness given to you? This is something I've already mentioned, imputation, right, or infusion as Catholics call it. Does Jesus' righteousness and justification, does it just clothe you like an umbrella or like a set of clothes? Or is it given to you? Like does it strike you at the root of your being and transform you from the inside out? That's one difference, and that's a real difference, but that's very, very different than Jesus, I need to earn your love, right? That's totally different. And I think if Protestants could see that the disagreements on justification weren't about Catholics being desperate to work their way up to heaven, a lot of the hostility would sort of calm down a little bit, you know? And so I do wish that Protestants actually knew what Catholics taught about justification. Got a long way to get there. And there's certain groups that are working toward this, but in popular sort of Protestant circles and the evangelical circles in which Shannon and I were raised, they're not. You know, when we were becoming Catholic, Shannon's pastor from her evangelical church, he sent me a sermon by R.C. Sproul about the Catholic view of justification, and he said, look, if you're going to become Catholic, you need to know this is what they believe. You know, I've heard that before, right? I'd once said that. and you need to know the responses. Like, have you actually considered that there are Protestant responses to the Catholic view? I was like, of course, you know. And so he said, so listen to this sermon. So I listened to this sermon, and it was terrible. And Sproul gets, I don't want to say everything wrong, but he gets most everything wrong. It's kind of a hack job. And that sounds kind of harsh. And Sproul helped a lot of people during his lifetime in their faith with Jesus, and he's been important to a lot of Protestants. But he did not understand Catholicism, and he sort of put himself forward as like an expert as a Protestant expert on Catholicism. So I listened to this sermon and I wrote up this whole response with quotes from like the Catechism or the Council of Trent or other Catholic documents showing that like he doesn't get justification right at all from a Catholic perspective. So he doesn't even know what he's attacking. And I never got a response.
Interesting.
But again, I just share that example to show that it was justification. That was it. If you're going to sign up for this blasphemous, idolatrous, ritualistic religion, know that you're committing yourself to this never-ending desperation to make God happy through your works. That's going to make you despair. That was the response.
Yeah, I understand that. I've heard all the same things that you've probably heard too with that. And I remember people trying to talk me out of Catholicism with some of these things. You don't understand the gospel. You haven't got the gospel right. And,
That's right.
And in this work that I do, it's amazing to me how many things are said to us about justification,
right,
as though Catholicism gets it wrong, and which makes you think, so for 1,500 years, the most important thing the church universally got wrong.
Yeah.
It kind of makes you wonder if that's what I have to buy into to reject Catholicism, then maybe I ought to give that a second look.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Could the church have been wrong for so long? This is big for me in a lot of ways. This is big for me on Mary as well.
Yeah.
So even though I there was no proof text that convinced me of the Immaculate Conception, the idea of Marian piety, it pops up pretty early, right? You start to see it in the 4th, 5th centuries, and by the 5th century, it's pretty firmly entrenched, and it's everywhere. It's in the East, it's in Greece, it's in India, it's in the West, it's in the Latin West, it's also in Middle Eastern Christianity, it's in Africa. So everywhere that Christianity sits, everywhere that the seed of Christianity gets planted, it blooms into a kind of Marian piety eventually. And what's interesting is when that happens, no one objects to it. We have no writings from the 6th century saying this newfound piety to Mary needs to be squashed, right? And so was everyone wrong, for over 1,000 years? And the same thing, of course, applies to justification. And yeah, the other thing that's interesting about justification, though, is that it was never considered the issue in the early church, right? It's not in the Nicene Creed anywhere. And so one of the things that I thought, one of the dissatisfactions I actually had as a Protestant was this elevation of justification as the issue of all issues. When I asked my now in-laws if I could marry their daughter, they asked me a couple questions to kind of vet me, right? They already vetted me as her boyfriend, but now it's like, okay, if you're going to marry her, I'm going to vet you harder. One of the questions they asked me was, how are we justified? And again, I share this not to cast any aspersion on them or to like make them look bad, or I'm not mocking them, because that's what their pastors had taught them to do. They had been taught, like, if you're going to have someone marry into your family, he's got to understand justification. And then I remember thinking after that conversation, like, could I have been a modalist or like a Trinitarian heretic? Like, could I have gotten the Trinity wrong, but justification right, and then be okay with that? And like the Nicene Creed is all about the Trinity, right? It's about the belief in the Father and the Son and the Spirit and various other things that have to do with them, right? About the incarnation and the Holy Spirit and things like that. But I got the sense that I could have committed some like 4th century Christological heresy.
You could have been an historian for sure.
I definitely could have been an historian.
I run into that
right.
every stinking day on my YouTube channel.
That's right.
When you talk about Mary being the mother of God, they're just like, that's impossible. She's the mother of the human part of Jesus.
That's exactly. I could have been an historian. I could have probably been a modalist, but I had to get justification right. And again, with Shannon's family, this is what they've been taught. Their parents had taught them. In fact, when Shannon and I got engaged, one other thing we were asked to do was listen to this sermon together that was about marital relationships from a biblical perspective. It's given by C.J. Mahaney, who was really big in Sovereign Grace Ministries. And in this sermon, C.J. Mahaney says that if someone wants to marry my daughter, he has to answer this question: how are we justified? And I remember I looked at Shannon, I said, is this where they got it?
This is where they got it.
Well, so my point is that they were just being faithful to their tradition.
Yeah.
They're not being absurd. They're not like this is what their tradition has taught them to do, is that you got to get justification right. Trinity, Christology, you got to get justification right though. And it was the very elevation of justification that I really started to call into question. Like, if you're gonna make one thing the main and only thing, it's not Jesus, right? Like it's not the incarnation. It's not the Trinity.
The canon of Scripture.
Well, I mean, that's a whole other thing. But
I mean, it is interesting why. Yeah. I mean, I can see why justification is such a big deal, but there's so many things, and we create these standards and these litmus tests around some things. It's the whole issue of, well, we have to have unity in the essentials and
That's right.
freedom in the non-essentials. Well, who gets to decide what an essential is?
That's exactly right.
And what a non-essential is?
That's exactly
we bring
right.
these things to the table as Protestants. That I remember, I remember doing that too. And a lot of Protestants I talk to have these systems that they've imported into their biblical understanding.
Yeah.
That are pretty arbitrary.
Yeah.
But they help them to justify their position.
That's
And
exactly right.
That's something that you start to question when you get into Catholicism. You say, now I have a different way to do that.
Yes.
And it's not just something that I created or that a few random people like 5 years ago created.
That's right. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, to go back to my former hero, John Piper famously said that he couldn't agree with every line of the Apostles' Creed because he didn't think it was biblical. But he's one of these guys who is very central in like the gospel coalition.
Mm-hmm.
And what a lot of evangelicals mean by the gospel are the essentials. But if you're so sort of divorced from historic Christianity, you have to come up with what the essentials are. If you're not going to just make them even the Nicene Creed, right? Or you have no authoritative body that says this is what the essentials are. You basically have to come up with them. And what often gets come up with are things like justification, penal substitutionary atonement, and there's certain other things. But yeah, you have to sort of reinvent the wheel and say, no, these are what the essentials are. But you can disagree with the creed, right? You can explicitly dissent from the creed.
Disagree about baptism,
or the sacraments. That's right.
In the Bible.
Yeah. And to be fair, there are a lot of Protestants who are very critical of these organizations, like the Gospel Coalition, precisely because they seem to not care about ecclesiology and the sacraments. But it's kind of a different conversation. But anyway, the business of having to reinvent what the essentials are and to discover for yourself what among these things is negotiable and not. It's tough position to be in.
Now, I want to close by talking about your work as a theologian in a college campus environment. I mean, that is an environment that, I live in the world of YouTube and things like that, but you're in a classroom. What's that like as a Catholic? Do you bring your Catholicism into that, or is that something that is sort of like, here's what I'm teaching you, and I just happen to be Catholic, or do you have to keep that separate? How does that work?
So do I bring my Catholicism with me? Yeah, absolutely. Now, it's not a catechesis class, right? So I'm not just taking them through the Catholic Catechism. But I teach. I taught and I will teach both at Mount Mercy and then at Providence and here in the fall at Catholic institutions. And so it helps when there's a kind of institutional expectation that Catholicism is the religion of the institution you're in. And I do bring my Catholicism with me. However, when you teach a class look, in college you teach upper level classes. So this fall I'll be teaching a course on sacramental theology. That will be Catholic through and through.
Oh,
right?
Sure, yeah.
Eucharist, baptism, orders, marriage, all of them. But when I teach a course like Intro to Christianity, like a foundations course, you just have to start with the narrative of the Bible. And especially if you're not in the Bible Belt with all these evangelicals who grew up knowing their Bible backwards forwards, I would have, like at Mount Mercy, and I expect this will be the case at Providence, I have Protestants who don't know the story of the Bible very well. And so you just start with creation. Like, what do we learn about the God of the Bible in Genesis 1? Like, God decides to create a universe and he speaks it into existence. Like, what does that tell you? Why does God talk creation into existence? What do you learn about God because of that? And when God wants to create, why does he say, let there be? There's a lot of things God could have said to create the universe. He could have commanded it, sun come out, mountains come up, but he says, let there be. It's almost an invitation, right? This is just an example of the kinds of things I do in class. But the point is when you're walking through the biblical narrative, especially when you're in like the Old Testament and the Gospels, you're talking about the Abrahamic covenant, the Davidic covenant, Mount Sinai, the plagues. That tends to be pretty ecumenical material, right? I don't have this uniquely Catholic spin on the Abrahamic covenant. And I find it quite rewarding. I often have, in my course evaluations, I'll have Protestants who will say things like, I was nervous about taking this from a Catholic, but actually, I understand the Bible so much better now. And so there's, especially in a course like Introduction to Christianity, there's a lot of material that's common. That shifts a little bit because when I teach Intro to Christianity, I then do a unit on the early church where I cover like the first 6 or 7 centuries. That gets a bit harder because then you start talking, you read these passages about the Eucharist, baptism, the papacy, apostolic succession, right? Mary, all this stuff is there in the early centuries. And so then it becomes a bit more potentially divisive.
Yeah.
But again, the students, I think they generally understand, I don't function as an apologist, right? I want them to learn the material. Whether they find it of interest that the early church thought these things, that's up to them at the end of the day. And if they come to my office, I'm happy to talk to them more deeply about any of their questions. But yeah, when you get to the early church, then things can get a bit more perhaps divisive. But also I see it as, look, I'm not trying to proselytize. I'm just showing you what's there in the early church. And if that matters to you then or not, then that's right, that's the question. Do you care that the early church thought these things? And I don't really see myself as an apologist, but I do see myself as presenting the Catholic faith and the Catholic tradition, absolutely.
Well, it is kind of an apologetic to just speak the truth about what is.
That's
when
right.
it comes to church history, when it comes
That's
to
right.
theology, and I think we need more of that.
Sure.
We need more people who are the best theologians, the best historians, the best biblical scholars, and who happen to be Catholic.
Yeah.
And there's not this separation of, well, there's this, but then there's the Catholic part. It
Right.
just is what it is.
That's right.
And you go from there.
No, I think that's right. I think it was the same when I was at Hillsdale. One thing that was really attractive about Catholicism wasn't that I was proselytized or brainwashed. I didn't take a single course in Catholic theology, but what I did have was Catholic professors who opened up reality. They opened up the world for me in courses on literature and history and philosophy. And I couldn't help but think when they were teaching, and again, they could be teaching non-Catholic texts, Plato, Aristotle, Shakespeare, right? And the way they would read, the questions they would ask, their very mode of teaching, even if it wasn't about Catholicism explicitly or even implicitly, I couldn't help but think, I want to live in your world. What is it about you that allows you to live in this universe that's so luminous with truth, that allows you to sort of wonder at the magnificence and the meaning of the depth of the cosmos and of human lives, and what makes you so attentive to these various things. And so I think that's exactly right. In fact, there was a worry by some Protestant faculty at Hillsdale that the Catholic faculty are proselytizing because there's so many conversions. But what these Protestant faculty don't understand is that they don't have to explicitly proselytize, and they don't. It's simply that students naturally see through the power of their teaching and their efficacy and the way their mind works, it does function as its own apologetic.
That is amazing. That reminds me, kind of bring it full circle back to your buddy Eric.
That's right.
Who it was his living it out in front of you that you looked at and thought, this is incredible. There's something about this guy. He wasn't trying to proselytize you. He was just living out his faith in front of you.
That's right.
And that in and of itself has more power than we can ever imagine.
That's right. Yeah. At the end of the day, Pope Benedict XVI has a fairly famous quote where he says, at the end of the day, the real apologetic are the holiness of the saints and the beauty that the church has produced. He says that's it. At the end of the day, those are the real apologetic things. And you can do your debates, you can have your arguments, and you need to, as 1 Peter says, be ready to give a reason for the hope that is within you, right? That if someone comes with questions, you need to have answers, but no one changes their mind in the middle of a debate. I never changed my mind in the middle of a debate with Eric. He never changed his mind in the middle of a debate with me. But what does tend to work on us, right, are those is holiness, is sanctity. And there's a deep relationship, I think, between beauty and holiness. And that has a way of working its way into the depths of you in a way that arguments don't. And again, I'm a professor. I'm not anti-argument, right? I'm fine with arguing. Right. I care a lot about truth. But I also realize that the way we're wired, that we can only rationalize ourselves so far. And this is also one final thing to get back to what was one thing that was hard about becoming Catholic. One of the objections I got from loved ones was they thought this was this highly intellectualized, elitist thing. Mm-hmm. It's like, you think you're better than us, right? The yokel evangelicals from Oklahoma.
Wow.
And you're becoming this, sophisticated Catholic. And you remember I gave you that line, philosophical garbage and esoteric BS. That was one of the lines that was given to me. It was this sort of sense that I'd gotten too big for my britches, And what they didn't realize was that, yes, the truth and the theology, that was all important, But there was also all this other, like it was the beauty, it was the witness of the saints. And not only that, it was also the fact that the church has been historically the faith of the poor and the illiterate. This is something Dorothy Day talks about in her autobiography, The Long Loneliness, that, Catholicism in America, it was often associated with being low class because it was the faith of the immigrants. You'd have these Irish and Polish immigrants coming into New York who worked very blue collar, working jobs. They weren't the elite, they weren't the educated. Those were the Catholics. They were the uneducated. Like Catholicism was the religion of the uneducated immigrant yokels, right? That's kind of how Catholicism was thought of in America for a long time. And that actually really appealed to me, that it was theologically and intellectually deeper than anything I could have fathomed, but it was also historically a faith that sustained the most ordinary of people, the poorest of the poor, even the uneducated and the illiterate, and it could do both. And so this is what, to get back to your point on the Catholicism being a fullness, a totality, that's what the word Catholic means, right? That's what the word Catholic, it's not just universal, it has this idea of totality, of plenitude, that it's both intellectually deeper than anything I can imagine, but it's also luminous enough in and of itself to maintain, it can be a ship, a bark, right, for the poorest of the poor they don't have to know deep theology, and they can still be devout, good Catholics. A lot of the great saints didn't know much theology. And so that was one thing that this accusation of you're becoming this sort of intellectual elite, right? They didn't see that, and I had no way of like really communicating to them that there was also this aspect of things, and that's right. At the end of the day, the holiness of the saints is I think the strongest apologetic there is.
Indeed. Well, Travis, it's been awesome talking with you, and we go to the same church for now, but you're getting ready to move, and that's going to be a sad day when we say goodbye to you and you guys head out to Providence, but we're going to be praying for you, and I'm sure we'll keep in touch. And
I hope so.
We hope that we see you soon, and we know that God's going to work through you and the work that you're doing, and He's just going to work through you and your family as you guys display the beauty and truth of our Catholic faith. And I believe with all my heart that anyone in your life who spends enough time with your family is going to wind up at some point in time recognizing that your Catholic faith has drawn you closer to Christ than ever before, and will become convinced of it too.
Well, thank you, Keith. I hope and pray so as well.
Awesome. Thanks, brother.
Well, thank you.
Awesome.
Appreciate it.
Well, thank you guys for watching, my friends. If you'd like to see me do more of these interviews, I want to encourage you to consider becoming a supporter of our ministry through Locals and Patreon. We have these two support communities. There are links in the description. I want to be doing more of these. I'm going to be flying people from across the country here to come and do these things. So your support makes that happen, and I greatly appreciate that. And if you do me a favor, leave a comment. Let me know what you thought of this interview. Let me know. And I want to thank all of you guys for your support, and especially for liking and sharing this video. And if you haven't done so, please make sure you subscribe. And I look forward to being back here with you guys next time. Take care, and God bless. Thanks for listening to Catholic Feedback with Keith Nestor. Send in your questions and comments to feedback@catholicfeedback.com. This podcast is brought to you by Stewardship, a mission of faith, and is also supported by our team at patreon.com/Keith Nestor. Please consider joining our support team. Catholic Feedback is a production of Down to Earth Ministries. For more information about Down to Earth, or to bring me to your parish or event, visit down2earthministry.org. See you next time.